Hello, and welcome to the All Things Narrative podcast, where we explore the relationships between the stories we love and the stories we live. I'm your host, Derrick Hatch, and let's get started. What's up, everybody? We are all here. Finally, in 2023, we made it. All right.
Whoop.
Who is in the house today?
I'm in the house.
We got Jerome Hansen.
Joseph Jerome, Daniel Lee, Hampton Stark Wilson, the Prince, soon to be King of All Saiyans. Shout out to Alec. He told me to shout him out before I left home.
Yes.
That's my boy right there.
Thank you, Alec. Faithful listener. And who else do we got in here?
Nick, I don't have the cool intro. I'm still learning that from Joe, but I am here today.
Hey, it's Jason.
I thought you were going to say something else.
I'm here.
Oh, man.
And I'm ready to share thoughts and opinions.
There we go. You guys see the promo video that you guys are all in?
Yes.
I didn't.
I actually did.
Yeah, what'd you think of it?
Good.
Yeah, you guys look great.
I mean, we do look good.
Yeah, I mean, you look good right now. I wish everybody could see you guys right now.
I did realize that my side profile looks super awkward, and in every single... Maybe it's not good to say on the podcast because then they'll all look for it. But every single B-roll shot,
Don't do it.
I'm pulling, like I'm stroking my beard.
I did not notice that.
You just see...
I've seen
like
that.
The fingers go up and then go down.
I've seen it probably like 100 times because of the editing revisions back and forth, and I never have noticed that that's what you're doing.
That's all you'll see now.
So now that's all I'm
people are
going
going
to
to see now, Jason.
Yeah, if you guys want to see what Nick, Jason, and Joseph actually look like, go check that out on the All Things Narrative YouTube channel. It's also now on the front homepage of allthingsnarrative.com.
And
Just keep it a mystery.
Guess who's by the names and the voices, who do you think is who?
Yeah, exactly. Try to match
Just
everybody up
listen and
there.
keep it a mystery.
Make
please.
it a game.
Oh, man. Oh, man. All right, guys. Well, so good to have you guys here as we continue our genre series. So why we love these different genres. We're actually recording 2 episodes today. So the first one you're hearing right now is about fantasy. And next time will be all about sci-fi, that good old science fiction. So today, I got to be honest, fantasy is an overwhelming genre because besides the fact that it's one of my favorite genres, there's just so much good stuff to talk about. I mean, there's a lot of crap too, but there's a lot of good stuff. So you guys ready to kind of get into this?
Yeah, we got a list. Let's get through.
Yeah. Now, a lot of this
Nervous
stuff...
but willing.
Yeah. A lot of the stuff is going to be overlap in stuff we've talked about previously, but there's other stuff that we haven't heard your perspective on. Like when we did Harry Potter, when we did Narnia and Lord of the Rings, and when we did Studio Ghibli, you guys weren't on those episodes, so it'll be cool to get your guys' perspective as well. And we can talk a little bit about MegaCon as well, because that was fun a couple weeks ago.
Megatron?
I'll talk about it.
Yeah,
So let's do
definitely
this.
talk about Transformers. Would that be considered fantasy?
That's good.
Transformers?
That's a good question.
What's
So
sci-fi?
what is
I think it'd be more
considered
sci-fi, yeah.
fantasy, right? So with all these genres, we're going through the book, The Screenwriter's Taxonomy, which you ordered that book, right, Nick? Did you?
No, I haven't gotten into it yet.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
it's on the
I'm
shelf.
halfway through it right now, but fantasy would fall as one of the super genres. So these are what are considered to be the 11 major genres. Then you've got macro genres, which there are 50, and then you've got like 150 micro genres or something like that. So we're trying to really explore these genres, what they are, and as we talk about in these films, one of the things that a couple people recommended and asked for with these genre episodes is to explain a little more why personally you guys love each of these particular films, right? So what is it that you personally connect with them? So I thought that was a good suggestion. We try to do that anyways, but being conscious of that, I think will be good. Yeah, so fantasy.
Come to see victory in a land called fantasy.
I've never
You can take that all out, but
No, I want to keep that in.
How big is the fantasy? Like, can you swim
The
in?
scope?
Can you ride a boat on the fantasy?
I feel like you can soar with the fantasy.
What kind of fish live in the fantasy, Derek?
Whatever kind you want.
Or can imagine.
Whatever you can imagine.
Ooh.
Exactly.
It's endless fantasy.
Yeah, it is endless possibilities, right? And so I want to give you guys a definition of the fantasy genre that we can, and it's you know me. You guys have heard the episodes. It's not a one sentence definition. It's more like a description of the fantasy genre. But to give you guys just something that'll kind of help us to build off of. And so I use these for when I do workshops and I help people to think about their life story through the lens of a particular genre. So with fantasy, if you think of the fantasy genre and how your life relates to it, here it goes. The fantasy story invites us to get lost in a visually enticing world of wonder. On the surface, these worlds of talking beasts and magical incantations are not like our own, yet they serve as a mirrored reflection of our own reality, with exaggerated characters representing different facets of our existence. These archetypes echo our complex psychologies, embodying our subconscious fears and desires. Many great fantasies are tales of a human in the world of enchanted myth and supernatural wonder. Along the way, they explore new lands, meet new companions, and discover profound truths about themselves and the world around them. As the protagonist navigates their quest, we are challenged to think about how we navigate our own world. Because fantasy explores not only what is possible within the realm of imagination, but what is desirable for our own lives. Fantasy causes us to reflect on what we want and what we don't want for our world. As we move from the familiar to the unfamiliar, we daydream in fantasy land in order to return to the real world with something of value, something that will sustain us throughout the various quests we find ourselves in. Fantasy ultimately reminds us that we are beings made in the image of a creator, given the ability to create and birth new worlds of endless possibilities.
One of the only things I heard in that was exaggerated characters.
Yeah.
That stuck out to me.
Yeah, how so?
Well, I was just thinking of Edward Scissorhands because I think that's one of the movies that I like most.
Yeah.
And like that's as exaggerated as it can get.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not, but
Yeah, I know.
that theme in fantasy attracts me.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you take an idea, right? Like in Edward Scissorhands, a guy with hands as scissors. It sounds stupid,
Created
right?
by a creator,
Sounds
but the exaggeration of him not finishing his hands and putting knives in, and
Yes.
him not finding a place, and the whole story of him trying to find a place in a world that is like ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right.
That he's surrounded in.
Right. Yeah, that's what a good fantasy writer and storyteller can do is they could take something that sounds ridiculous and make it believable.
So what stuck out to me was just the concept of a world being created.
Yeah.
And that was what kind of helped me with the difference between science fiction and fantasy. The difference is fantasy is an entire world.
Yes.
It's different.
Correct.
Everything is completely different. Science fiction, it tends to focus on like, let's say one thing that's completely different and a reaction to that, but it's the whole world is different. And sometimes the protagonist is familiar with that.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the protagonist is not. Like in
Yes.
Lord of the Rings, it's not like some human is transported into this world and they're like, I don't know what's going on, but it's a hobbit who has never stepped outside of
Right.
the world that he knows, and the fantasy is all around him. All the tales and myths are around him. And Harry Potter, it's the same way. He is just completely normal, but he's part of this world that's much bigger than himself, that's much different than what he thinks.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jason. The world is the big differentiator there because sci-fi, as we'll talk about in that episode, it's still about our world.
Yeah, it seems like
it
it's
takes
more
place within our world.
Realism. It's more of a realism. You can see, like, you can look outside and imagine, like, oh yeah, like a starfighter going by or something like that.
Right.
But like Jason said, fantasy is its own thing. It's its own entire existence.
Yeah, it's a
set of
world,
rules.
and that's what makes the fantasy genre so challenging to write is you literally have to create a world. You have to do convincing world building, and you have to make it believable. And that's also what attracts a lot of people, both creators and audiences, to fantasy. And that's why I think they have some of the most devoted fan bases out there. I mean, we went to MegaCon. How many people were dressed up as fantasy-like characters?
A lot.
like elves and things like that.
Well, so now I'm thinking Gotham. Is that now that may be based on like a New York City or something, but that is a created world. So Batman Returns, is that fantasy crime? Seriously.
Yeah.
No, I was thinking
Is that-
because it's
I'm
like,
going to try to get Batman Returns.
Batman
in here.
Returns will be on this podcast right now.
but I get it because it was like certain Batmans, like, are those considered like a fantasy
What like Nolan's Batman, for example, I would say no.
Yeah.
Nolan's Batman is really trying to take, even though Gotham is like a fictional place.
It's Chicago.
It's still, yes,
It's
exactly.
Chicago, right,
it still feels like a real world thing.
So
But
Tim Burton's Batman Returns, that is a fantasy version of New York City.
Yeah.
I would
Chicago.
say that's the interesting thing about some of the superheroes, and with Burton, with his Batman, especially with Batman Returns, even more so than his first Batman film. I do think he is leaning more into this kind of fantasy, this darker fantasy element into it, right? So I think that's fair to say.
So the comic books in general, these heroes, is this fantasy?
So if you were to read a comic book from Stan Lee, like a 1960s comic book, the way he's describing the comics as he's writing is he is calling them like fantasy adventures. And adventure is a macro genre, of course, which we'll talk about. But so I think in the minds of a lot of the people who created comic books, I do think fantasy is what they're thinking. I think some of them might be science fiction as well. I think that's fair to say as well.
Yeah, because I think of like the Eternals and things like that. That is more like a fantasy thing, but with like the Avengers, they are still technically in like a New York or like our world. So it's like it's kind of fantasy within a little bit of non-fantasy within that same universe. It's kind of
I have no doubt that the superhero, which the superhero is a macro genre, but it's such a large genre that now encompasses so much beyond just fantasy and sci-fi that we have to dedicate our own episode to it, because the superhero genre actually, as we're going to see when we do it, it touches at some point all the other genres, which is something that not many other genres we can say that about, which makes it unique.
So it seems like depending on the director or whoever's vision, you can create it into fantasy.
I think so.
Once you start exaggerating the characters
Yes.
to a certain point, then it becomes fantasy.
Because you could look at Danny DeVito's Penguin and Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman in that film, and you could kind of shrug it off and be like, oh, I prefer Colin Farrell's Penguin in the new Batman, right? And Zoe Saldana's Catwoman or whatever. But there's something that you have to admire when you understand what they represent, right? Yeah. What do they embody? And Burton's a good storyteller. He's you could say what you will about some of his movies, but he's a good storyteller. And so he knows, like, when he's taking a character and he's exaggerating those features because the Penguin in the Batman Returns is not really like the Penguin in the comics. The Catwoman is kind of like the Catwoman in the comics. And so he's exaggerating certain things. He's bringing it to a fantasy realm, but he has a good purpose within the story for that, and it makes sense. So I think that's what a lot of good fantasy writers do, is they kind of exaggerate those things.
Okay, I got a question. This is kind of a plug question as well.
Okay.
So what would you guys consider my series then? As someone that is creating like their own films and things like that, what would you place mine?
So for the
historical fiction.
Historical. So
autobiography.
That is not a lie, right? Is that fair to say? Autobiography?
That's fair. Yeah, that's actually really good.
I think that's fair. The thing I love so if you guys don't know, for those of you who are listening, Joseph does stop motion films that you can watch on YouTube, and there'll be a link to them in the show notes here.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're clearly in the superhero genre. Like, that's obvious.
Yeah, but there's elements from personal experience that are put into the story, kind of.
Right.
But I think that happens with like a lot of stories in general.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily change the genre. It's just a more personal story that you've made within another genre, which I'd say is fantasy maybe?
I think you are mostly in the fantasy sci-fi realm.
Okay.
Because I think of what a lot of your subgenres would be, or your macro genres, and they would fall under what those genres typically are. I mean, you do have a lot of action pieces as well, but I think you spend a lot of time building up a world.
Yeah.
And I think the world building is a key fantasy thing.
Okay.
Right? And would that be fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. No, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
Like the world building process is like I feel like my main priority, because you can't be immersed in the world. You kind of really don't care about the characters.
So do you connect, Joseph, with someone like a JRR Tolkien, who literally had all these scribble papers and documents of trying to conceptualize and make sense of his world to himself as he's writing.
No,
right?
definitely. I before even making like the films in itself, I spent probably at least like 5 years either creating like the entire storyline, so I know where everyone's going, what the world not just the world looks like, but the universe looks like, because I do like space movies within it as well.
Yeah.
But like, I spent the time to create what everything looks like, where everyone is going, and then actually doing the process of actually filming it. So I feel like I took my time to know what I'm going to be showing everybody and what they can kind of piece together.
Because fantasy is as much about the process as it is about the final product of what you create, right? And I think that's a key thing that you get there. I read Tolkien's book. He has a book called Tree and Leaf, which is similar to the C.S. Lewis book that you read that we've talked about in here before. So with his book Tree and Leaf, he talks about the fantasy genre, or as he calls them, fairy stories. And so
That's funny.
I'm taking this home.
So here's what I love about this book, right? Is he goes into, now I'm going to just say up front, I think Tolkien is one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time. He's also a little bit of a fantasy snob in a way, because this whole book is a lot of like, well, this is fantasy and this is not. And there's a lot of things that I disagree with that I think we all would disagree with because of where the fantasy genre has come. Because this book was written, probably like 75 years ago or something like that, right? So a lot has changed since then. He goes on a big rant how he believes fantasy will never work in theater or in film.
That's funny.
It's hilarious because he had no idea where it was going, right? But here, there's some interesting things that he talks about that I think will be a good segue in talking about examples of fantasy. There's something called pure fantasy. And this is what I think Tolkien, it's fair to say this is what Tolkien was writing. So pure fantasy is where you are literally creating the world from scratch. It is not in any way connected to our world. It is, Lord
of the Rings.
It is Lord of the Rings. Yeah. Yes. Lord of the Rings is an example of pure fantasy. You're building everything from the ground up. You've got hobbits, elves, dwarves, man. You've got these different entities there. He says that that's fantasy in its purest form. And I do agree with that. Like, I do think that is... It's obviously very difficult to do that. I mean, he went as far as creating a whole language, for all this. So he and Star Trek, same thing. That literally has a whole language of Klingon.
I was gonna say, would you consider Star Wars that as well? Because they do also have not just one but multiple different languages.
Yeah. So Star Wars would fall under. So it took me a while. Yeah, so it took me a while to figure out if Star Wars was fantasy or sci-fi. But if we go by this definition that it is not our world, Star Wars has to, by definition, be fantasy. Now, I did find out that there is something in a subgenre, a macro genre, or it might be a micro, but it's like basically the space fantasy, right? So it's a story that uses space in order to create its worlds and tell its story and whatnot, right?
Okay.
And so Star Wars does have some sci-fi elements into it. It's very much, it's a space opera. That's what a lot of people call Star Wars, right? So I do think Star Wars is like Lord of the Rings, a pure fantasy. They had to build that up from nothing.
The Fifth Element with Bruce Willis?
Yeah. I've never seen Fifth Element.
That'd be fantasy.
Those guys are creepy and crazy and not of this world. But I love that movie.
I love that movie too.
I like exaggeration. I think it proves points in an amazing way.
It was really interesting to kind of just watch like how the society is in just general, just like how they made a whole world, even back then with like film directing and just like where filming was at back then. I was like, oh, this is dope stuff. I love practical effects stuff. Like I just love it. So that movie got me.
Well, if you could do a fantasy film with practical effects or CGI that looks really, like, I still think for Lord of the Rings being like 2001, 2002, 2003, that is still some of the best CGI I've ever seen, especially like the motion capture for Smeagol, right?
We'll get into the best CGI though with, I guess, fantasy. Jason knows what I'm talking about.
Planet of the Apes?
But no, that's sci-fi. That's sci-fi.
What? But he knows what I'm talking about.
All right,
we'll get there. We'll get there.
We'll get that.
Can we keep talking about Batman Returns though? So I'm literally thinking about this though.
Yeah.
Because we just watched it in the car on the way to Comic Con.
So many silly bands on his
I have a lot of fidgets in my hand right now to keep me focused.
Some fidgets too.
Okay. But so the penguin is very exaggerated, right?
Yes.
It's not like in the comics. It's over the top.
In the comics, he's just a mob boss, like what you see in with Colin Farrell's interpretation in the Matt Reeves film.
So I'm thinking of this line at the end of the movie where he jumps on Batman and he says, "You're just jealous that I'm a genuine freak, and you have to put on a mask to be a freak." But if Penguin is so exaggerated to like this guy is an absolute freak, then that point hits home. Really strongly.
Totally agree.
That's just a really cool.
It is.
It's a really cool storytelling device.
Well, and that's why Burton has a thing in his movies for the outsider, the outcast, the freak, right? That's what I would argue drew him to Batman more than actually the Batman mythos itself. But it's the ability to tell these stories.
I think exaggeration is just a lot of fun. It's freeing in a lot of ways because you can play with this character and then go off the page.
Oh, absolutely, right?
Yeah, cool.
And you can go into.
I think that's what they did with Last Jedi.
No, that was not exaggeration. That was just pure.
There were some things exaggerated, all right.
Cinematic, masterful storytelling.
How does it always come back to Last Jedi?
Do we have anything to
If Rian Johnson gets 3 movies to do a new Star Wars saga,
I don't think it's going to happen.
It will turn the tide of Star Wars completely around and it would dominate.
I just want it to happen so that like we can talk about it.
Because I stopped watching The Mandalorian. I don't really even know what's going on in that show anymore. But give it to Rian Johnson.
I heard it's not very good anymore. I've lost interest.
I'm kind of liking it.
I mean, here's the thing. You might get your Rian Johnson trilogy because the fact that the first Star Wars movie they're releasing since the disaster of Rise of Skywalker is a Rey movie, that tells you that they don't know anything and they have not learned. So
that was not Rian Johnson's character.
I know.
He was given that. But if you give him 3 movies,
I think Rey was her most interesting in Rian Johnson's
Oh wait,
film.
did you hear the rumor about how Ben Solo's Force Ghost impregnates Rey in the new movie?
I did hear that rumor.
You heard that rumor?
I've heard that.
Listen,
now we're really in fantasy. We have exaggerated.
Yeah, we're in fantasy
land.
Oh man! But what if they do?
Yeah.
This is madness.
So
We should go see the Rey movie together.
As long as Derek's there.
Oh my gosh. We got time. So with Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings is a quintessential fantasy experience. It also embodies something called the epic, like the epic journey, right? So, and a lot of these fantasy stories embody the hero's journey in some way. And Lord of the Rings is no exception to that. But Lord of the Rings, you get all these fantasy creatures, right? You get elves, you get magic, you get dwarves, you get
ants.
You get orcs, hobbits, you get talking trees, you got wizards, sorcerers, giant eyes that are all seeing.
You know, it's the best part of it. You don't see a giant spider throughout the whole series. That's why I'd rather watch Lord of the Rings over Harry Potter.
He could have done it too.
Oh my goodness.
I have not seen any of the Harry Potter.
Dude, you're Ron Weasley.
First off, I mean, he gets Hermione, so I guess that's cool.
Yeah. So if Lord of the Rings, so there's some other categories that Tolkien gives in Tree and Leaf of talking about fantasy. And these are not like typical genres that we would speak of today, but I think they're helpful in understanding the fantasy genre. So one of them is, it's another type of pure fantasy. This is called the mythological tale. So the mythological tale is where you're telling something that's set really far in the past to try to explain the world today in some way. So I think, Joe, have you seen Princess Mononoke?
No, I haven't. I have not.
Have any of you guys seen that movie?
Maybe once when I was wee little.
I don't know if you would have seen this when you were little. It's pretty violent.
Wee little.
Don't put it past me.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to make a bold statement. I think Princess Mononoke is the single greatest fantasy film ever released.
Is it an anime?
It's an anime, yes.
Okay.
But it's this pure mythological fantasy tale done where literally in one film they build a convincing world with a very allegorical tale about the tension between humanity and nature, and it's stunning. So if you haven't seen Princess Mononoke, I've also talked about it in the Studio Ghibli episode. It is my top ranked Studio Ghibli film. But a lot of the Studio Ghibli films are fantasy films, right?
Okay.
Which I got to give a shout out to Jason, because Jason, he got me into the Studio Ghibli panel at MegaCon.
He self-sacrificed.
Really?
It was a leap of faith. He had to go take that.
Did you hear that story, Joe?
No, I didn't hear the story.
So we were in line for that panel, and literally they were gonna, this panel, they were gonna show like the whole process of how they make these films, right?
Uh-huh.
So in terms of like doing the backgrounds and this layer of animation cells and this, right? And showing never before seen like concept art and the original art and from Miyazaki and stuff.
Okay.
So we were in line, and we get up to the line, and there's like 2 people ahead of us, and they say, sorry, we're full.
It was like a group of 3 or 4.
Yeah. And I'm like really bummed because I really want to go to this panel.
Derek.
I know. The lady comes out and says, we have room for one more. Jason pushes me to the front.
Good.
And says, this guy's like obsessed. He needs to go in there.
Oh, Jason's
And
such a nice
I know.
friend.
That's why we can't pick on Jason.
Yeah, we can. It's the whole point of friendship.
I'll pick back. Give me a purple band. No, I was like, he has to go. I felt very, no, it was a little different, but it reminded me of Into the Spider-Verse. I'm like, you gotta go home.
You gotta go home.
I just want one.
Yeah. So I owe Jason that, because that was a beautiful experience. I cried twice while I was in
You
there.
did not.
I did cry twice in there.
To let people know, I was just taking pictures with random people.
Joe
That's
was
why.
okay. Joe,
I was not at the
you were a
panel.
low key celebrity at MegaCon. The amount of people that walked around and asked for your picture.
Well, he walked around for
I
you
was
asked
I-
picture.
Yeah,
No,
high
he
key.
asked them.
I was about 3 hours asking people for pictures. Nick was with me for a bit,
Yep.
and then they went to go do panel stuff. And
You got so many pictures. I felt that I missed out on the whole event because I did not get pictures like you.
Nancy was
didn't-
like, "You need to take pictures," and I said, "Okay, babe,
I learned how to do MegaCon
and you
now
got-
from Joe.
You got him.
got to get the pictures in."
Oh man. Yeah. So a lot of those Ghibli films are fantasies, where they have to craft that world. Now, in addition to the mythological fantasy, one more that would be considered a pure fantasy is what's called the morality tale. But we might know them as fairy tales. So fairy tales, most of the time, they might take place in something that resembles our world,
Yeah.
but they're still its own thing at the end of the day. But they're fantasy stories that are specifically created to impart some sort of moral, right?
Yep.
So we've done the Disney episode, so a lot of the Disney films are going to count for that. So you're going to have your Snow White, your Sleeping Beauty, your Little Mermaid.
But you're also gonna have like Red Riding Hood and things like
Yes,
that too, right?
yes, absolutely,
Like
right?
what's it called? Humpty Dumpty.
Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah,
Hansel and Gretel.
Jack and Jill. They went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Would
Listen-
that be considered, or is that just a nursery rhyme?
That's a nursery rhyme.
Okay.
But
So the Shrek universe is the entirety of all those, but with irony and satire.
yeah, so you remember
one of the greatest
the
compilations.
spectrum, right? Nick and Jason, when we did the metaphysical journey episode, where we did the spectrum between comedy and drama. So Joe, just to catch you up, Joe, we talked about how comedy and genre, according to this book, are not genres in and of themselves.
Okay.
They're actually spectrums that every single story falls on.
Okay.
So any story you can put and drop in the spectrum, and you could say it's 66% comedy, 33% drama,
Yeah.
right? Shrek would fall under that. So Shrek would fall under not just a morality tale, but also a fantasy that leans more towards satire. And satire is very popular in fantasy, right? You've got Monty Python. Have you guys ever seen Monty Python?
No, look, I was ready to talk about it if it ever came up.
Yeah.
Here's
so,
your chance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Go
this is
ahead,
your
talk
chance,
about
right?
it.
So Monty Python, Shrek,
Good fun movie.
Lost your chance.
Yeah.
yeah, these are satires here.
But what I like
Gotta be
is
quicker
that,
than that.
So what I liked about Monty Python and the Holy Grail, much like a great movie called Tenet, is they used a concept called inversion.
Inversion.
So they start at fantasy and this world that's created, and they drag it back down to reality.
That's not inversion, that's subversion.
Subversion, whatever.
Tenet is still a good movie. Guys, Tenet is still a good movie.
Tenet is still a good movie. Don't let my affiliates.
Oh, wait.
Nice try trying to bring Tenet into this. Leave that garbage movie out of this conversation.
I don't know if it starts from reality and goes to fantasy. This one starts to fantasy and goes to reality.
Well, I'm
making stuff
Monty
up.
Python's
Back to
hilarious.
reality,
So
My favorite part is the rabbit.
the rabbit.
The rabbit.
Yeah, well, that's everyone's favorite.
We're talking about Alice in Wonderland now?
No, so
We'll get there.
Or Wonderland in
Monty
the Gorge?
Python and the Holy Grail, to give you a picture of it, it's like a medieval fantasy movie, but it starts off for these two guys riding horses above a hill.
And
and you hear this
the coconuts.
Oh, I remember you guys telling me this.
of
Yeah,
the horses,
but it's
and they
coconuts.
come up and it's just like clapping coconuts together. And they're talking as if like this is a completely normal thing, and the guy's like, "What are you doing? You're not riding a horse. You're putting two coconuts together." And like, it's just digging right into like, this is not real. This is dumb. They even go so far as like they're running away from this monster, and it's about to kill him, and then they go, and then the animator had a stroke, and they show the guy the desk just keel over, and then the monster fades.
It breaks the fourth wall a lot.
Yeah, it's like. It completely destroys the world that it creates.
So it's kind of like Harold and Kumar.
So, Joe, Monty Python.
Is that a fantasy?
I don't consider it a fantasy.
Monty
but-
Python is what I would
different.
call the ultimate troll movie.
Okay.
It's a troll movie. Literally, the movie doesn't have an ending. It
Yeah.
just stops.
The characters get...
It just stops, and it's a blank screen for 5 minutes,
good
and
on
then the
that.
movie's
Yeah,
over.
high key.
Yeah,
It's a troll
That-
movie.
I feel like that'd frustrate me.
Yeah,
to
the
my
characters
core.
are about to go get the thing that they've been seeking the whole time, and there's been like... I don't know.
Spoilers.
British police have been... spoilers.
We've been spoiling it.
British police are like catching up to them because they commit all these crimes and murders. Which
Like, there's a
they
literal
normally-
film crew
Yeah.
that starts to come in on screen.
Yeah, one of the
Okay.
caravans gets like his head cut off by one of the knights. He just runs by and goes ah, and then many scenes later you see like a police cars pull up and like there's a woman crying and they're like trying to investigate this. And at the end of the movie, they're about to go in.
They're about
the
to get the
castle,
Holy Grail, what
and
the
these
whole
police
movie's
officers
after.
come up and they put him in handcuffs and put him in the car and take him away, and that's it.
So that is an ending.
That is the ending. It's just, but you hear nothing about them. That's it.
But that's what's funny about Monty Python is you basically, after you watch it, you realize, oh, they were just LARPing.
Yeah.
They were just pretending.
It's like, this is you all.
Like this isn't.
Oh,
Comic-Con.
LARPing.
Comic-Con take it too far.
I don't know
Yes,
what LARPing is.
exactly.
It's where you dress up like
fantasy characters.
Yeah, like fantasy, and you go out and you actually like battle and
You
do that.
actually-
That's
what that
it was.
movie is?
Live action role
Yeah.
playing.
Yeah.
Except
Live-
for the rabbit. I don't know. I can't explain that one.
I can't explain the rabbit is the best part. I cried laughing every time I watch that movie
And the Holy
with the rabbit.
We should go LARPing. I'd like to go. to go fight people.
No.
That sounds fun.
I'd rather contain it to
But
the warehouse.
you brought up you
the
brought, so you brought up Shrek too. Shrek's a good one because Shrek is kind of a subversion of the morality tale in a way, because Shrek is very much a morality tale, right? But it is also satirizing the fairy tales.
The best entry of that film, the what's it called? The film franchise is Puss in Boots 2, though.
See, I haven't seen Puss in Boots 2, but I've heard it's so
need
good.
To go see it. Have you seen it?
No.
You need to go see it.
I want to
It's
see
on
it.
Peacock though, so
Okay.
I can go watch it tonight.
We should go watch it tonight. I'd watch that movie tonight. That's a good movie. Sorry.
It is.
No, that's cool. And I love Shrek 2. Shrek 2 is my favorite one.
High key. Shrek 2 is great.
But yeah, so
I'll take the first one.
yeah, no, first one's
one
good
is
too.
good. Yeah, no, I like
So-
that it makes fun of it, but it also like celebrates it at the same time.
Exactly.
Kind of like the last.
No, stop. No, I was gonna say, not like the Last Jedi.
Wow.
Oh, we should have brought.
Where is it?
I was just saying we don't have any more.
We're out of booze.
So no, I do mean that thought though. Like it kind of lampoons a lot that have already been made. Like the gingerbread man is like has his legs broken. The guy's messing around with him.
That's in the second one?
That's in the first
That's
one.
the first one,
Yeah.
Yeah, first one's really good.
Yeah.
There's all these other tales that just like
So-
they're all different or like made like super realistic. Like
I-
oh yeah,
I-
it's Sleeping Beauty.
I-
She's
I
asleep.
want to show my kids Shrek so bad, but one of the things that makes Shrek work so well is when you know all the other stories, all the other fairy tales. So
Yeah.
I'm actively introducing them, which has been a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. My brother got them the Grimm's fairy tales that are uncensored. So we've been doing a few of those too.
The Grimm one?
So would
So
Shrek
the
be
Brothers
the,
Grimm.
So would Shrek be the Infinity War of the Morality Tales universe? I mean,
That's
those are
funny.
the Avengers.
That's fair to
movies.
say,
They
right?
all accumulate.
Yeah.
They
literally
you
all
have
come
to read all those to understand
So
this.
listen, Shrek
Oh,
came
we
out
have
when
another-
I was the perfect age. So
That's
Shrek
funny.
Shrek came out when I think I was 7 years old, and I was obsessed with fairy tales.
How old are you?
How old am I now?
Yeah.
31.
Oh, what?
So when it came out when I was like 7, and it was the perfect time because seeing all those fairy tales on screen, I might have been 8 to be fair. I might have been 8. But seeing all those fairy tales on screen in one movie was mind-blowing to me. Like it was like my Infinity War.
Wow.
It was as a kid. It was huge. But I have a lot of fun. I'm having a lot of fun teaching my kids these fairy tales. It's interesting, like when you experience fairy tales through kids.
Yeah.
And seeing their reactions to them, seeing what they take from them, which is really fascinating. Like Jack and the Beanstalk has always been one of my favorites. But then you get Addie saying, why is Jack stealing everything? And it's a good thing.
Because it's a cold road, no blanket out here.
Well, to be fair, the giant took it first. And so Jack's just trying to get it back. Okay, Daddy. So why does Jack kill the giant? Well,
'Cause
the
it's a
giant
cold, no blanket.
represents, right? Then you have to start getting into all that stuff.
And you realize that they are kind of messed up, some of them.
a lot of them.
They are. Oh, yeah. But again, it's what Nick said earlier. They're exaggerated. Like they represent something. The symbolism in these stories is very, very high. Like one of my favorites is Snow White because I love the story of Snow White that you have the queen who wants to be fairest of them all. And obviously she's getting older, so she's not. She needs to make way for the next generation, and she refuses to. She's trying to have eternal life in a sense. She's trying to be immortal. And in order for her to be the fairest of them all, she literally has to take a potion. She has to create something that pollutes her humanity. So she can't see her own beauty because she's aging. So she has to become this gross hag of a witch in order to try to become fairest. All the while, she doesn't realize that she's dehumanizing herself, right? In order to try to kill the innocent youth of Snow White. Because Snow White represents that purity, that innocence. And before the world kind of comes and taints and makes you insecure, right? So that's what I love about these fairy tales.
Yeah, that was really deep.
I'm gonna be watching Tenet with my kids. Derek, you're a good dad.
Well, that's what I try to help my kids see is like it's not just a
funny.
cool story. There's actually something it's trying to say.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why I like Snow White. That's why you can go deep with all these fairy tales and see that.
One thing that I really like with Shrek is that he's actually, it starts with a guy who's disillusioned to the morality tales, to the whole fairy tale
Right.
thing. Like,
Right.
it starts with him going to the bathroom and reading this book and goes, that's not going to happen. And he uses the page to wipe his butt. He doesn't care.
Yep.
He's like, I'm going to stay in here. I don't care about no world outside of myself. I don't care about any wonder or anything. I want to stay in my swamp and live in a hut and in the mud.
Right.
But his life becomes that, and he sees the wonder of the world. Well, I don't think he sees too much wonder, but he sees outside of what he's got around
Absolutely.
him. And he goes to appreciate and love these exaggerated characters that are around him. So maybe it's even about him exploring the fairy tales and the morality tales.
I like that.
So, that's good.
Finding like meaning in them.
Well, another example of that.
Shrek's an avatar for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
He's like, I don't care about this. I have no place in this. This doesn't concern or bother me at all. I don't need to know about this. And the movie's like, well, let's just see. You're going to love these
that's
characters.
good.
You're
That's
going to
good.
see yourself in these characters. So keep going.
Another story that kind of does that too, but it is satire, but it's more on the dramatic side than the comedy side, and that's Into the Woods. Have you guys ever seen Into the Woods, the play or the film?
I saw the movie.
Okay.
But I saw it like a long time ago. But it is like very exaggerated. Like with it, isn't it like all the stories combined?
Yes,
Okay.
which I saw Into the Woods. That was the first play I ever saw. It was in 5th grade. We went on a field trip to Fallbrook, California, Joseph.
Oh, look at that.
And
California.
Yep. So
You don't like that place.
I don't.
our native land.
Yeah.
So Into the Woods, though, is interesting. So people either love Into the Woods or they hate it because it's very what you call a postmodern tale. It's like The Last Jedi of fairy tales.
See?
So
we should be hammered.
So
right
the first we should be the first half of Into the Woods is exactly what you described, Jason, where there's kind of an avatar for experiencing all the fairy tales, and that's the baker and his wife. So you experience Jack and the Beanstalk, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, and Cinderella, right? Those are the four in there. And then you get to the halfway point, and all those stories reach their happily ever after. And then the whole second half of the film, which people either love or hate, I actually really love it.
Throw it like in like reverse or something like that, or
kind of.
Yeah, okay.
I'm trying to remember. Basically, there's something that happens to where the giant wakes up. The giant that they thought was killed wakes up, and there's like this big earthquake, and it changes everything. And so the whole second half of Into the Woods is about deconstructing all those fairy tales and subverting your expectations. So, for example, spoiler alert. For example, we find that because Cinderella and Prince Charming barely knew each other, we learned that Prince Charming wasn't really in love with her and was lusting after her. And so the moment he gets an opportunity to pursue another woman, he cheats on her. Right? And so you find that there's this, like what you said, there's kind of like a reversal that happens. And literally in the second half, they just start killing off people.
Yeah.
Like literally this person dies, then this person dies. And literally you have the fractured splinters of all these fairy tales that have to basically go and create a new story.
And then doesn't I think spoiler alert, if this is true, doesn't the wife die as well with like the baker?
They kill off the co-lead character, which is insane, right?
Yeah, I gotta rewatch that movie. I did remember like
I love Into the Woods. It's my Last Jedi for sure. It is because a lot of people hate it for the same reasons as Last Jedi, but I like it because I like exploring what happens after Happily Ever After. But I like it. But again, I'll make the same argument I've made before. Into the Woods is its own continuity and its own thing. It's not the definitive canon of all fairy tales like Last Jedi is. But anyways.
Until they rewrite it with like time travel and Star Wars.
A Star Wars multiverse. You find out The Last Jedi was an alternate.
Yep. Yeah, you definitely know that's coming.
If they did that, Last Jedi might get redeemed for me. That might be how it happens. If it's just a what if story. If it's just a what if, right? I might be able to take it there.
Oh, that's funny.
So Star Wars, it says it's in a galaxy long ago, far, far away.
That is
weird.
Bring
it to here?
That
Somehow
is weird to think that Star Wars actually takes place in the past.
I mean,
for our time.
I mean, when you look in the sky, all the stars that you see are actually like have been dead and dormant for like a long time. So
yeah, that's a good point.
They're gonna have some messenger come from the past to our world and hand us and sit down in George Lucas's couch and tell him the story about all this stuff, and then that's when it ends forever.
Would you be satisfied with that ending, Derek?
I don't know. I don't know what I'd be
satisfied with. If the baby of
with.
Rey and Ben Solo comes to George Lucas in the present and says, "This is what happened with the Skywalker trilogy or the Skywalker."
No, I would not be satisfied. So a lot of these fantasy stories are about wish fulfillment in some way, right? The wish fulfillment piece is really big there. Now, all these stories that we've talked about so far, these are what Tolkien would call pure fantasy. Now, these other types of stories are things that Tolkien kind of poo-pooed on in his book. He said, well, these are not real fantasy. They're poser fantasy. I don't agree with him here, but I'll share with you guys and see what you guys think. So one of the famous disputes, because you guys know JRR Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were friends, right?
Yeah.
So one of their famous disputes and arguments that they had was with C.S. Lewis creating the Chronicles of Narnia series. Because Lewis wanted to create what's called a travel tale. So a travel tale is where you have someone in our real world, you start there, and then somehow through magic, they get to the fantasy world, right? So, and then by the end, they most likely will go back to the real world. So everything that happens in the fantasy world is real. It really happens. It just doesn't happen in the real world. So Tolkien really chided Lewis for this. He did not think that it was a good idea for Lewis. He thought that Lewis was doing a cop-out by having his Narnia series be travel tales. But I would argue that it explores a different dimension of fantasy, right? Because that is what the fantasy genre for an audience is meant to do. We are meant to go play in the fantasy world when we read these books, when we watch these films, right? And then we come back to the real world and we take something of value. And that's like what Chronicles of Narnia does, is it's these characters who were in World War II that they didn't have, there was nothing that was in their control, right? The planes were bombing the cities around them, and all they were they were stuck at their relative's house. And then they go to this magical realm of Narnia where they realize they can be brave. Yeah. And they learn how to find courage. And then that helps them to navigate this really chaotic world that they find themselves in, right? Especially as young people. And so that's what Lewis was writing, is he's writing a story for young people of how can we navigate a world that seems beyond out of our control. And Lewis's argument is that fantasy helps us do that. We go to fantasy, we take something of value, we come back to the real world, and we're not the same. We're changed as people. That's what he really loves about that genre.
And so what was Tolkien's definition?
Tolkien is more pure fantasy. Like it has to be its own world in and of itself. Lewis had this other perspective, which I think Lewis's perspective is illustrating what fantasy is to us in our world, right? So what are your guys' thoughts on that? And even Narnia in general, like, have you guys read those books or seen those films?
Yeah, I've seen all of the films.
Okay.
And honestly, I hadn't thought of it, but that's a pretty meta way to look at it. Like, the viewers, or like the people who are experiencing fantasy, are also in it and they're affected by it. I didn't think of it like that. Yeah. A lot of times it's hard for me to like think too far in depth to that movie because I just sit and it's a spectacle and it's fun.
Yeah.
But I've seen
and it is a spectacle
so many times that it's almost boring.
Yeah, I've seen it a lot too. That movie, I mean, people don't know how big that movie was. Like in 2005, there was a fantasy boom. I would say the fantasy peak in terms of film.
Because then Percy Jackson come out around
the 2000s.
That time too?
Yeah,
as a book or a movie?
That's when all the films were really coming out, was that 2000 to 2008, 2009. It's when a lot of these big fantasy films were really in their stride. But that first Chronicles of Narnia film, I still love it. I think it's a great adaptation of the book. I love the books. I mean, nothing compares to the books, but I think I don't think the other two movies are as good though. I do think they really hit it with Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. But now, apparently, Netflix is making a Narnia series.
Netflix is going to go bankrupt. It's all right.
They got rid of Megamind. They're downhill from here.
Yeah, high key.
They're going down.
Oh, man.
It sounds like C.S. Lewis is doing fantasy adventure.
I think that's fair to say.
Because the characters are going on an adventure into a fantasy realm and they come back. So it sounds like Tolkien has a point, but the elements still apply in C.S. Lewis. He's taking everything that Tolkien is talking about and making it his own. Yeah. And Tolkien's just saying, I prefer just a pure fantasy. Right. But then he gets off when he says, well, this is the only way to do it. Yeah. But it sounds like C.S. Lewis is doing fantasy adventure. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think a lot of fantasy adventures operate like that as well, because Narnia is not the only one that does this. So here's another one that does it. It's another fantasy adventure, and it does it in a little bit more of a subtle way. Because Narnia, there's a clear break between when you are in the real world and when you're in the fantasy world, and it's the wardrobe, right? Yeah. But a movie where it's not as much of a clear break and it's a little blurry, or I should say a series, is Pirates of the Caribbean. Yeah. Yeah. So you're in the real world and you see like, okay, this is like colonial British times, right?
And then you see this pirate that shows up. And you're like, that's kind of odd, but I guess there were pirates back then, so okay.
And then the pirate turned into a skeleton.
Yeah, as you go further and further into that first film, you find you're becoming more immersed in a sort of fantasy realm that's overlapping with the real world.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of, I think, fantasy adventures do, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of other fantasy adventure movies.
Well, let's stay on Narnia and pirates for a bit because, right? So you guys have seen the Pirates films. We've talked about them in one of our Why We Loves.
I feel like low-key Inception kind of could be fantasy adventure.
It could be.
I feel like what Tolkien would be mad at is like this whole fantasy movie, and then they wake up and it's a dream at the end.
Oh, okay. Yes.
And so I think what I'm saying is I think Tolkien would hate Inception.
So no. So Nick,
that was good.
You are 100% right. Because
he sat up in his chair, people.
I did not. In that book, Tree and Leaf.
Oh, yes, he did. He did.
In that book, Tree and Leaf, he says that what you just described is a wake up and the whole story was a dream.
Yeah.
He said it is the biggest insult to fantasy.
It was all a dream. I used to read Word of a Magazine.
He says, now let me get your take on this, all right? Okay. He says to tell a really compelling, believable story, and then to say within the story that the story is a lie is the ultimate betrayal of the audience.
Yeah, I feel like I lean towards him. And I was leaning towards him as you were describing it before with C.S. Lewis. I was thinking he hates the idea of it just being, you wake up and the whole movie's over and
it was all a dream.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest examples of this, and he talks about this in the book, because one of the most famous fantasy stories of all time is this dream tale. It's Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and see that.
So I would say that Narnia doesn't really betray that because it was real.
That's my point
when
too.
they go back to the other world and all that time has passed, but they've seen evidence of themselves in the history of that world. It's kind of crazy to come back and you have been dead so long in that realm that you're a myth. Which I think is crazy.
You're mentally, what's it called? When they came back in the first movie, they were mentally probably like in their 30s. But when they came back, they were still like 15, 14, like 13-year-olds.
Right.
That's a wild concept. You lived a whole life already, and then you got to go back. To be honest, I couldn't do it. I already feel like I've lived enough already. And to live and then come back and be like, wait.
Let's talk at the end of this.
So they do come back, right? Through some of the books and whatnot. But then there's something that happens. So the last book is called The Last Battle. And that's where it's basically the book of Revelation for Narnia, where it's, the end, right?
Yeah.
And so for The Last Battle, what's interesting is, and this is good to talk about with this fantasy, because 3 of the kids, so Peter, Edmund, and Lucy, they come back for The Last Battle, even though they're adults, right? So they come back, and The Last Battle is this great reunion where all the characters, all the human characters from the real world and all the fantasy characters from Narnia all come together for the final conflict, right? Wow. There's one person who does not show up, and it's Susan. And everybody's asking why. And Aslan says that Susan left, she no longer saw value in Narnia, in the fantasy world, right? She basically grew up, she moved on. And what they imply in that book is that she's lost her faith. Because if Narnia and Aslan is an allegory for the spiritual journey and coming to Jesus and all that, right? Yeah. So it implies in Last Battle that Susan when she loses her faith in the fantasy world of Narnia and Aslan, right? She in the real world loses her faith in Christ. Yeah. So that's an interesting concept Lewis explains there, of this idea that your connection with something like the fantasy, because Lewis believed that actually helps us, it grounds our faith. He talks about Christ as the true myth. He talks about, we look at all the myths of history and we see that there are these glimmers that are pointing ultimately to the light of Christ, right? They're reflecting that light in some way. Yeah. And so Lewis's argument, which I think is brilliant, and I totally agree with it, is that we don't look at those myths and we poo-poo them and ride them off and say they're just rubbish. We say, no, myth speaks to what is real and what is true, right? And when you look at those myths as just silly nonsense, you're going to be tempted to look at God and Christ and spiritual things in that same way as well.
Yeah, no, even what you're saying, like fantasy kind of helps ground our faith. That's, I believe that, because in a sense, it's like to believe in these concepts, to believe what like the Bible speaks of, even with the descriptions of just like angels and like how God is and his throne head and things like that. That could be that's just kind of like a wild concept.
If you don't believe that, then
yeah, exactly. But it is a sense of just like, because with the Spirit we only see in part anyways, but it does help us to understand that. I feel like even with comic books as well, just like that type of aspect as well. So no, I think that's really cool.
Well, and I think it's interesting that the three of the biggest fantasy franchise, like if you ask somebody like, what are the biggest fantasy series of all time? They're probably going to say Lord of the Rings. They're probably going to say Chronicles of Narnia, and they're probably going to say Harry Potter. And all three of those were written by Christians.
Harry Potter's written by a Christian? What about so I was trying to sit here and think about
Harry Potter is an incredibly Christian story. I'm sorry if that offends people out there, but it is.
J.K. Rowling.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of too.
No.
Go read about her.
No, but like, did she just...
I mean, I can't speak for her faith.
Did she Susan?
I can't. Listen, I can't speak for her faith now. Like, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But
I know. Well, I know that she has said how influential her Christian background was, and she even cites Tolkien and Lewis as big influences on Harry Potter. But yeah, and I think Harry Potter.
It's interesting.
Those stories are incredibly Christian. And I know if you're not a Christian and you hear that might offend you. But the themes of them, especially the last one, I mean, you literally have a character that has to die and resurrect in order to defeat the enemy. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't get more on the nose than that.
What other pure fantasy stories are out there that like are really famous? Like, because I was thinking,
like in terms of one-offs or like a series as a whole.
So like with Tolkien, he was a purist at heart, but I feel like nowadays everything has kind of
muddled.
Yeah, like there's mixed genres and everything that comes out. So you have Harry Potter, Chronicles of Narnia
that do the and Pirates of the Caribbean.
So what other pure ones are there? I would think Star Wars is a pure one.
I agree. I agree.
How to Train Your Dragon.
So aside from animated.
But that's still like Vikings and things like that. So that's still grounded in realism.
There are dragons.
But that's still in our legends and things like that too. So that's not really an entirely own world.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
I mean, honestly,
Treasure Planet? Or no, yeah, Treasure Planet.
I feel like Tolkien would
I think Treasure Planet would be space fantasy.
I mean, honestly,
Treasure Planet's a pure fantasy.
Yeah.
In terms of films and whatnot,
great movie.
It is.
I mean, you'd have to probably go further back to a lot of books.
Yeah.
Because pure fantasy has been around as a genre for a long time. But you'd probably have to go back and really explore that through novels and books and whatnot. Because I mean, I would argue, even if they didn't believe they were fantasy at the time, this is what the Greek myths are.
Mm-hmm.
The Greek myths are morality tales. Right? Yeah. They're that mythological where they're going really far back to try to explain why things are the way they are now. Mm-hmm. So I think like fantasy is one of the oldest genres. And I mean, if you haven't like to anyone out there, if you haven't like studied or read or there's actually a show on Amazon Prime where they literally like with these cool animations do the Greek myths. And they're awesome.
Really?
Yes.
What is it called?
I think you just type in like Greek myths on Amazon Prime and it comes up. But it's cool because like the Odyssey, which I think the Odyssey is one of the greatest stories ever written. If the Odyssey had not been written, we wouldn't have superheroes. We wouldn't have high fantasy, like, right? Yeah. The Odyssey is a pure fantasy story told as pure fantasy and not just as religion. you could literally they have the Odyssey on there, where each episode does a different piece of the Odyssey.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to watch that.
And so Tori and I will watch them when we have nothing else that we know to watch. We'll throw one on, and they're so cool because they're stories like great fantasy stories. They're ultimately about what it means to be human. Mm-hmm. So that's what I love about them. Well, but here's one that I could give you as another example, Nick. So this is another category of fantasy. It's called the Beast Fable. So these are pure fantasies as well. Go ahead.
We'll say, will we ever get back to pirates? Because we did not.
We can. Yeah, that's fine. Let me clarify this real quick for Nick, since he brought it up. So the Beast Fable is essentially where humans are not the center of the story in the world. It's talking animals, talking beasts, right? Not as they're just mere characters in there, but they are these central characters. So the Lion King is an example of a beast fable, right? So I guess Tolkien would not call those pure fantasies. He would give them their own category of beast fable. Because to Tolkien, a pure fantasy...
It sounds like Tolkien only considers The Lord of the Rings as pure fantasy.
Yeah.
Like, come on, Tolkien.
Because Tolkien's whole thing for fantasy is that it has to be centered around a human protagonist.
Okay.
So a beast fable would not be a human protagonist, but he still said it has its own merit, right? He didn't say it's bad. Mm-hmm. He just said it's not pure fantasy, but it's not pure. But beast fable, that is an example of a world, where you got talking animals and stuff. So Lion King, I think, is one of the best beast fables. The fact that most Disney films are adaptations of fairy tales, but The Lion King is them crafting their own.
Rango.
And I gotta say,
Rango. Yep.
Yeah, Rango's another one. Yes, exactly. Yep. Although I would argue Rango is a Western.
I was going to say the same thing.
It's definitely a Western. So when we get to our Western episode, Rango's a good one to bring up for that. Rango and Django, exactly.
Top 2 modern Westerns.
Honestly, this is the only ones I'm going to be talking about.
Yeah. Did you want to say something about pirates, though? Since we're still kind of in this.
We did, right, Joe?
Listen, I'm here. I'm ready for it. Come on.
So Joe, did you watch and finish Dead Men Tell No Tales?
I have only watched the first 3, and I remember a bit of the 4th, a little bit. But when I said earlier that the best CGI would have to go to Pirates of the Caribbean because of Davy Jones, just how he looks. Oh my goodness. Yeah, honestly, I feel like the pirates have like the best.
That is an exaggerated character. Yeah. And done so well.
Yeah. That is also an exaggerated take.
But he's just so dope. With the tentacles.
Oh,
yeah. Well,
Nick, do you like these films?
No, I do. I like the first one.
I like the first one,
and I think I like the second one a little bit too. I haven't seen them in a long time, but the first one I do enjoy a lot. The first one reminds me of I think childhood in some way. I think I was sick.
That's fair.
Or I think I had my wisdom teeth taken out, and I was just drugged up and watching Pirates of the Caribbean.
It's the best way to watch.
When those get put on, it's like just an escape. And
it really is an escape.
I like those.
Yeah.
Well,
but only the first one, and the second one I do remember liking a little bit too. But the third one I stopped watching in that one.
Really?
And then I never watched the other ones.
Because the third, I'd say I like the first one. I like the second one more.
Mm-hmm.
The third one is pretty good, and they do start to fall off after the third one. But I will say that the fourth and the fifth, they still have the same elements of the Pirates series that I like. And what I like about this is there is depth in it, but also there's just spectacle, and it's just fun. Mm-hmm. There's stupid things that happen that I'm like,
fun.
This is ridiculous. Okay, Disney. I feel like that's something Disney would say.
What?
Swashbuckling fun.
No, swashbuckling is actually that's actually a.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's part of adventure. Yeah.
Oh, forgive my rudeness.
So like Indiana Jones, my rudeness. Stuff like that.
No, I would even say the second one is like the movie that you would watch multiple times. Like if I feel like watching a Pirates of the Caribbean movie, I'd watch the second one. I feel like the third one, it kind of went off the rails in a sense, but it wrapped everybody's characters well. Like their story arcs throughout the 3 movies. So I was cool with the whole pirate lore, like the randomness of like all the pirate stuff, like the sea creatures, the curses. I loved it. But again, kind of like with Nick, after the third one, I stopped watching them.
Even there's 2 things that can make your fantasy fall apart. if we think of fantasy films that are not very good. So one of them I would say is cracks in the world building. So like, obviously fantasy, anything can take place, but you still have to develop an internal logic within the world.
Works.
And if there's inconsistencies, right? Like, so like, you know, Leia all of a sudden being a force, her force thing in Last Jedi, right? That was like, wait, you just invented a power out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
So
I agree with that part.
but so that's one is inconsistencies in the world building. And the other one, the other one, Joe, that you just brought up is characters.
Yeah.
If you lose connection with your characters, it doesn't matter if you have a good world.
And I feel like that's what happened with like the pirates, because like with Johnny Depp, he wasn't really like giving it his best after it, and like
he was kind of phoning it in a bit.
Yeah, like, and with that, it's kind of like okay, he was the best thing about pirates, and now it's all kind of just downhill with these new characters, these new like end of the week villains.
Is Orlando Bloom in the other ones?
No, they're not. He's at the end.
In the last one.
Yeah, he's in it. He's in there for 2 minutes because the curse got lifted. And
We didn't see the end, so
Actually, I did watch that part of it, but there's an end credit scene with that too. But it's still just like he's in it for like 2 minutes, like we're like for a hugging scene. Like this kind of broke everything after that.
I honestly had no problem with him not existing anymore ever. Like he did at first. I was upset that he came into the fifth movie. I'm like, get out of here. We're finished with you. For me, it could have ended at at the first three movies. It could have ended and been good and just we're gonna see the Fountain of Youth. Oh wait, no, Jack stole it. Aha, got you again.
Jason,
out to sail.
That's a good point you bring up, because one of the detriments to fantasy stories is when they go overstay their welcome.
Yeah, you don't.
And they go on too long. So like you've got
Star Wars.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Star Wars.
Yep.
Yeah. Agreed.
SpongeBob.
I don't think so, bro.
But
SpongeBob needed to end.
yes, I agree. But another example, though, like again, going back to Lord of the Rings, you have three films which are considered to be three of the greatest fantasy films of all time. I mean, Return of the King, I think still to this day is one of the only fantasy films ever to win Best Picture.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, which is a huge accomplishment. So then you did the three Hobbit films, which I could understand because The Hobbit is a book, but I think it didn't need to be three films. You could have done it in two. But then now they're doing Rings of Power.
Yeah.
And now they're going beyond the source material, right?
Yeah.
They're going beyond the original story, and it's tanking. And I think that's what you see with like Pirates and a lot of these series is Star Wars, when they overstay their welcome and they go past, they no longer have a compelling story to tell. They just want to stay in that world to make money.
You know, it's interesting. I feel like, and I'm surprised we haven't talked about this, but Avatar is a very interesting concept, because that movie, like the first one, the time length between the first one and the second one is about like 10 or so years.
Yeah, which I still haven't seen the second one.
But it's still like people are actually really still interested in Avatar. So like he still plans on making his like 4 more movies or however more. Like, but it's still like that element of he could learn from these mistakes of like with the franchises that he's seen already and build upon his world with that, because the storyline is kind of whatever, but the world that he's built in these movies I feel like is what's really drawing people more so than the plot.
I think and I think James Cameron, like several filmmakers we'll talk about on these episodes, I think James Cameron is a great filmmaker in the technical art of creating film. I don't think he's the greatest storyteller though, right? But yeah, no, Avatar's, that's a good one to bring up too. So with these fantasies, let me shoot off a few others as well, as we're going to start to round out this episode, because I think we've gone through quite a bit, right? A lot of the heavy hitters here. Let me round out some ones that we haven't quite talked about, right? A lot of fantasies have romances as well in them. So there's one. Have you guys ever heard of this film called Stardust?
No.
Heard of it.
So it's made by Matthew Vaughn and written by Neil Gaiman. And it stars Charlie Cox as the main character. And it has Henry Cavill, Robert De Niro, Michelle Pfeiffer, your Catwoman, as the villain. Right? So it's a great, I was surprised it's a sleeper hit, I feel like. Because you guys are hearing this and you're like, I've never seen it, never heard of it, right?
I've heard about it though.
But it is so dang entertaining. It's basically Charlie Cox has to, and this was like his first big role. So he's like a little youngin. It's so cute. He's like not Daredevil yet.
And this is called what again?
Stardust. So it's funny because we were listening when we saw Charlie Cox at MegaCon.
Yeah.
The way he acts is more how he's like in Stardust than how he is in Daredevil.
Okay.
I was like, oh, okay, he's more naturally like that kind of character, right? But in Stardust, there's this girl that like is super bland, but he loves her. And her wish is that she's like, I want you to catch me a shooting star. And he's like, okay, fine, I'll go do it. And then if I catch a shooting star, will you marry me? Yes. All the while she's being courted by Henry Cavill. So Charlie Cox, then he goes into this fantasy realm where he learns that the star is actually a girl. And it's this adventure of him and the girl. And it's really dang entertaining as a film. It's pretty funny too. So that's a good one that is more on the romance side, right? Fantasy romance there. So Stardust. Another one that I wanted to bring up as well is that a lot of fantasy stories deal with a mission of some sort. So Stardust, there's a mission, right? A character has to go and do something. A lot of these stories have a mission, but one of the most famous ones that does this is what I think is one of the greatest films, and many people would argue is one of the greatest films ever made as well, is The Wizard of Oz. Oh no.
So,
oh boy, here we go.
With The Wizard of Oz, my first introduction to The Wizard of Oz is actually a African-American spinoff called The Wiz.
The Wiz, yeah.
Okay. So some
I've
of
seen The Wiz.
us, have you heard of it, Nick? Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess.
I've seen The Wiz.
But yeah, so I saw that first.
Okay.
And then I was like, oh, it's The Wizard of Oz. It was off of this.
Right.
So I'm fine with The Wizard of Oz, but again, my first introduction to it was The Wiz.
I mean, it's fine. Same story,
Yeah.
just different flavor of it.
Yeah. Flavor. Seasoned.
Oh,
yep.
man.
Michael Jackson's in it.
Yeah, Michael Jackson. He's a scarecrow, right?
Yep, he's a
and
scarecrow.
It's what's her name? Diana Ross as Dorothy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's got a good cast.
My
Got some
mom
good
loves that
songs in
movie.
it too.
Mm-hmm.
So Wizard of Oz is a cool one to talk about, right? Because not just the story, because the story, if you've ever done a deep dive on the Wizard of Oz, it's one of the funnest stories to analyze symbolism wise, because the Wizard of Oz is an allegory, or a lot of people believe it's an allegory for populism and the Reconstruction movement post-Civil War. And so it's really fascinating to see what all those characters represent. But The Wizard of Oz is interesting from a filmmaking perspective because at that time, you just had films that were in black and white. Mm-hmm. The only time you had color films was in animation. So that moment, and I get chills. Like I've showed The Wizard of Oz to my kids now, and I get chills watching the film go from black and white to color and realizing that was the first time we saw live action color in film. And getting chills of like, what would that have been like? Yeah. Like if I could go back and have a theatrical experience and be in a theater, right? I think people
take it for granted. They didn't have pictures.
Yeah, no,
right?
yeah.
That was the first time you saw something in color?
That was the live action color.
But even like a photograph.
No, I don't know about necessarily a photograph, but a movie. Yeah. Like going to a movie theater and seeing live action people.
Because it'd be color. Black and white, and then it's just like color. Like, whoa, wait, yeah, that'd be.
This is possible. Yeah. This is the greatest movie ever.
Yeah, high key.
Well, and that's an example of like a movie that's a fantasy movie, but it made a fantasy that people had into reality.
Yeah.
And films have never been the same since, right?
That's dope.
Because color was so expensive that even after Wizard of Oz came out, it took decades before the majority of films were in color.
That's wild.
It was so ahead of its time, and it was so expensive of a process. But it's like that moment is so good when you see the change. I get chills. I get chills watching it. Imagining, but it's a good story. Wizard of Oz is a fantastic fantasy story, you know? Now, here's the thing. Is it all a dream?
Is it all a dream?
I think that's up for debate. I think, this is my argument. I think The Wizard of Oz is the first multiverse story ever told. Because think about about it.
That's funny.
Think about it.
That's funny.
In the first 10 minutes, they established Dorothy's family. Oh, that's the Scarecrow. That's the Lion. That's the Tin Man. That's the Witch, right? Literally all the characters are there in Kansas in the first 10 minutes. Then Dorothy goes to another universe where they're all in Oz and it, right?
We should have Kane. They should remake it with Kane show up in it. Do the whole black and white experiences.
Dorothy and the Multiverse of Madness.
I was just
Dorothy
thinking
is-
that
Yeah.
Kane come in and kill them all.
Yeah. Dorothy is
That's too
Marvel
much.
canon.
That's too much.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I mean
That's cool though.
Yeah. So here's another example of a film that I think is in the fantasy genre that would have blown people away, that I would also love to have gone back and seen in the theater for the first time. And it's a fantasy mystery story called Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
I love
that
that
is a
movie.
good
Can you imagine seeing for the first time cartoons and real live action people interacting on
I watched
screen?
the behind the scenes of that. Just like with one of the scenes with the octopus when he's actually serving people, they're using sticks and things like that. The whole auditorium, they built like a second level so that they can walk around with sticks like for the penguins to hold it and what is it? Post-production, things like that. Oh, they put a lot of time and energy into this movie. And it's great too.
As technical filmmaking, Nick, it's one of the best films that's achieved something.
Yeah.
You know?
I think I have. I remember it, but off the top of my head, right now, I can't recall it.
And I think it's shocking. I think besides the technical aspect of it, I think it's also would have been shocking for people to see Disney and Looney Tunes characters
Together.
together and in an adult film. Because I don't care what you say, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is not a kid's film.
No.
I don't care. They may say all you want. It's 80s PG. That's what I call it. Or it's not really PG. But that film, I rewatched it a couple years ago. I'm like, this is great. I got a long time before I can show this to my kids, though.
The saddest death is when the main villain's dipping the shoe into the acid.
oh,
Yeah, and
yes.
then he's just whimpering. Yeah, I was like, oh.
Dang,
That's evil, bro.
But it brings a finality to something that doesn't die.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, it's the death of an idea. It's the death
Right.
of something that's
Yeah.
created. Like, oh, these things actually can be melted away. That's a scary thing.
Yeah.
So if that's not untouchable, then nothing's untouchable.
Right. If we're talking about great films, I think one of the greatest fantasy films ever made. It's a fairy tale type of film, but it also does that blending with the real world so well. And that's Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth. You guys,
seen it.
I haven't seen it. I haven't
you've seen Pan's Labyrinth.
There you go.
Okay.
Nick with the
So,
save.
so what do you think of Pan's
I
Labyrinth?
have
Nick?
not seen it.
Oh, haven't seen it in a little while, but I have.
Okay. Dig deep.
I remember the monster. The monster was awesome. I remember the editing in that movie because it was kind of unique. And I remember that mushroom under the bed. I remember some of the parts of the movie, but really,
Out of context.
I remember. Yeah, I remember
There's a lot of iconic
that
moments, right?
officer killing that guy really violently. Yeah.
So
not
Pan's
much.
Labyrinth is an R-rated fairy tale.
Oh.
So it's about a pregnant mother and her young daughter that go to live with her abusive husband, who's her stepfather, and he's the colonel or something like that of the military as they're trying to establish fascism in Spain. So it's a really dark story.
Okay.
Really dark. It doesn't shy away from anything. But what happens in the story is that this girl stumbles upon this fantasy realm. Now, I would argue that the Book of Revelation dives into fantasy a bit. And the Revelation is a genre of literature called apocalyptic. Are you guys familiar with that? So where you're basically taking fantastical images and symbols and using them to illustrate what's going on in the real world simultaneously, right?
Okay.
So Pan's Labyrinth is what I would call the closest film that helps you understand the Book of Revelation.
Dang.
Because this is what happens. she goes into this world of fantastical mythological images where every single thing represents something. Just like in the book of Revelation, right? All those images mean something. And if you have to know your Old Testament to understand what they mean, right? Mm-hmm. So in Pan's Labyrinth, you have to understand what all these, because they're playing off fairy tales. So you have to understand what they mean. But what she does in the spiritual realm, because I'm going to call it the spiritual realm, because that's essentially what it is in Pan's Labyrinth. What she does in the spiritual realm affects the real world or the physical world. Mm-hmm. And what she does in the physical world affects the spiritual world. So you actually see how they're intertwined. Just like what you're trying to see with Revelation, right? Yeah. How what happens in heaven affects earth and all that stuff. So what I love about Pan's Labyrinth is how it creatively kind of depicts that and illustrates that in this kind of modern, very dark way. And since you guys haven't seen it, I really don't want to spoil the ending of it because I do think it's worth your time. I do think it's one of the greatest fantasy films, maybe one of the greatest films ever made, because you'll never see anything like it. And especially the fact that it's all practical. There's pretty much almost no CGI.
Got me there.
Yeah. And so like the makeup, the costuming of all the creatures and stuff is really, really phenomenal. But the ending is so disturbing. I'm not going to say what it is. It is disturbing, but it is one of those endings that makes you think a lot. And it really does something to you. And I'm going to leave it at that. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet is something called magical realism. So have you guys ever heard that term before?
Would that be Harry Potter?
No.
Would that be Bright, the movie with Will Smith? And
I've never seen it.
Oh.
Wow.
So, you know what I'm talking about, right? Oh.
Even Derek's never seen it.
So magical realism is where you take one element of something fantastical or magical and you put it in something that's either our real world or pretty close to it, right? So an example of that, I'll give you a very practical example, is Pinocchio. Okay. You have a puppet that comes to life. That is from fantasy, right? Mm-hmm. Blue fairy, talking cricket. Those are fantasy pieces, but you bring them in to the real world in some way. And that's what's called magical realism.
So that's like the reverse of when someone goes into...
Yes, exactly. So that's where you pull the fantasy thing into reality. Okay. So that is also fantasy as well, the fantasy genre, right? So Pinocchio
is... like Space Jam?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I would argue that.
The Sonic the Hedgehog movies.
Yes, that's true too, I would argue that as well. That's Sonic, funny. I think, would fall under that too.
Shout out to Ronnie Lowe.
Because Sonic the Hedgehog, especially more so the first movie than the second one, but that movie is really about pulling Sonic out of a fantasy world and putting him in, right? Yeah. And they have to interact with him. That's magical realism right there.
That's funny.
Yeah. Cool. So Pinocchio is probably my top 10 favorite stories of all time. So that's definitely one that I love. And you still need to finish Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio so we can have a conversation about the existential crisis that is life. Because I never thought I would watch Pinocchio and have an existential crisis. So
I wake up with them.
You wake up with they're your breakfast, right?
He sees that movie when he looks in the mirror.
So the final one I want to talk about, Pinocchio is a metaphysical journey as well as a fantasy, right? So a lot of these genres go side by side and overlap. So the final one I want to talk about is a fantasy story that exists as a metaphysical journey in and of itself. And so metaphysical journeys, as you know, right? We did that episode. There's stories that are primarily centered around a character undergoing some sort of spiritual, religious, or philosophical transformation in order to get what they need. And so one of the best examples of this novel and one of the most adapted films of all time is A Christmas Carol. So with A Christmas Carol, and this is why Christmas Carol is another story. It's one of my favorite stories of all time. It is my favorite Christmas story, hands down, not even close. Well, okay, sorry, not including the story of Christ. Sorry. Besides that, it's my favorite fictional Christmas story. But here's what you got with Scrooge, right? So that's the real world, and it is a dream, but it is a dream that is accessing real memories. So Scrooge actually has to relive parts of his story, right? He relives his past, he gets a different perspective on his present, and he gets a glimpse into his future. So it is real. So it is using the dream, but it is using the dream to explore memory, which is something that dreams actually can do. But it is a fantasy that is ultimately serving this metaphysical journey. And so I love A Christmas Carol, but you guys have any thoughts on that one?
I love it. Which is your favorite iteration of it? Because I really love the one with Jim Carrey playing like everybody.
I do like the Jim Carrey one quite a bit.
One of my favorites. Yeah. Especially The Ghost of Christmas Present, probably my favorite part of that movie.
Yeah. Considering that I think Christmas Carol is a story that is very important for both kids and when you're older and you're more jaded on life, right? I think one of the best versions, you might laugh at me for this, but one of the versions that best actually handles that, both those demographics that I think the story is for, is The Muppet Christmas Carol.
It's funny, actually.
I love Muppet Christmas Carol because you have Michael Caine, who's in all kinds of things, but
every Nolan
film, right? But Michael Caine said
above the mic.
he said when he was going to do Muppet Christmas Carol, he said, "I'm going to treat it like Shakespeare." He's like, "I'm going to treat it like it is the role of a lifetime," and he took it seriously. And I think he's the best human actor in any Muppet film, hands down.
Is he the one from How I Met Your Mother?
No, Michael Caine is like a thespian.
Yeah.
You didn't know?
I don't know. It's Alfred.
Yeah.
Yes, Alfred in the Nolan.
I don't know him as his actual name. It's Michael. It's Alfred.
Faces or references over names.
But but with the Muppet Christmas Carol, what I really love about it is it has the playfulness, right, and the fun that you should have as kids. But it's also, especially, they just put the extended version on Disney Plus, which leaves out like a scene. And I was like, why on earth would you leave this scene out? It's so good. Listen, don't make fun of my Muppets.
Hey,
I love my Muppets.
I'm just laughing at the extended cut.
Extended director's cut of a Muppet Christmas Carol. But I love it because Michael Caine gives such a good performance as that jaded man coming back to everything, right? It maintains the darkness of the story. It maintains some of the religious aspects, but I love A Christmas Carol. I mean, that's a film I try to watch every year. I love that it's a way of accessing your story and seeing your story from a different perspective and realizing, I mean, this is literally what I do in narrative practices. That is A Christmas Carol, is I take people through their lives, help them to see it from a different lens, live different perspective, different way, and have them live a different story moving forward. And that A Christmas Carol represents what I try to do with people.
Yeah.
So that's why I love it. So here's what I want to do to close off this episode, all right? Because we're all hungry here. So here's how we're going to close it out, all right? I want you to choose one fantasy story that we talked about, all right? And I have a list here. You guys can look at the list if you want. I want you to choose one fantasy story to close out and talk about why you personally really resonate and connect with it, all right?
If anything I can relate to, it would be Lord of the Rings. And just how we live this life in brotherhood, not so much expressed in the movie, but also sisterhood, where we're banding together for a common goal, and there's a very real good and there's a very real evil.
Yes.
And there is also a lot of uncertainty, and there are betrayals when people lose sight of what's important, and there's a temporary blindness when, let's say, the ring is tricking people. The people that are tricked and may fall to an end or something happens with them, they're not hated. It's not a betrayal that was really meant from the heart. They were tricked. And the characters are still loved. They're still honored. they didn't completely condemn spoilers Boromir.
Yeah.
Or when I think it was Pippin, he messes up.
Yep.
When he grabs the orb, like it's understood. Even Sam is betrayed by Frodo.
Yeah.
Because he's tricked, but he still pursues him and he still helps him. And I think the friendship at the core of that is something that I really relate to and try to keep that in my heart.
Yeah.
It's a very pure friendship story.
That's good.
And it's in the midst of all this crazy stuff that happens. It's just two hobbits way out of their zone. But
which blows me away that you still haven't finished Return of the King, because the greatest act of friendship is in that movie.
Actually, it's in Tenet, but okay.
I think I put Tenet at a close second for that. Oh my gosh. Because it's really hard to beat Samwise Gamgee, but Tenet, I'd say.
Neo in Tenet is
Neil's that dude.
Greatest cinematic frame.
Haha, sci-fi, breaking it. Anyways.
In 10 minutes.
Come back next month.
Are you talking about the end of it? Because I have been spoiled on the very end of it.
Just the famous line where Sam says, I'll carry, the whole... Where he's like, if you can't go any further, I'll carry you, right? Mm-hmm. And he carries Frodo to do the hard thing that he knows he has to do. Because Frodo would not have completed that mission without Sam, right? No. Sam really is the vital piece. Even though Frodo is our protagonist, he is not a lone protagonist. That story shows us that we cannot go through these quests, these journeys, these adventures of life alone.
No.
And if we do, it is to our own detriment and peril.
And it's not like Sam could have done it alone either.
Right? No one could have.
No one.
They needed a fellowship. That's what I love about the Fellowship of the Ring, right? We need everybody. We need the elves. We need the dwarves, right? We need the wizards,
from all nations.
humans, hobbits. Everybody plays a role in this story. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's good, Jason. Joseph or Nick, how about you guys?
I like Edward Scissorhands because he's emo, and I'm pretty emo too, so I connect with him on that. I think I like Tim Burton a lot. I think that movie is just beautiful in general, but I like the idea of like being so different that you actually have like scissor hands. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I just connect to him. I like it. It actually kind of goes to what you were just saying. I think he does try to do it alone. Yeah. And he ends up alone, I think, in the castle. Yeah. So it's actually the exact opposite of The Lord of the Rings. It's a tragedy, which I don't mind. I don't know. I just with my boy Edward Scissorhands.
Yeah, no, it is. It is a tragedy. I think of that scene with the snow, with the ice, right, and the snow. That's like one of those great like cinema moments with the score and everything. Mm-hmm. And
he's so awkward, and he's like his scissor hands are cutting.
But the fact that he could take what makes him strange, alienates him, and awkward, and create something beautiful out of love. That's my favorite part of the film. That's the part that moves me every time I watch it. No matter how badly he's treated, he's able to take it all and do something genuine and kind with it.
Yeah, that's my answer, not the one I just said.
Joe, how about you?
Would Bridge to Terabithia be one?
I've actually never seen Bridge to Terabithia.
Okay. So, well, what
do you think?
I think it is.
Leave the room because I haven't seen it. I don't want to be spoiled.
You should probably leave the room.
All right, y'all call me when I come.
Yeah. Get out of here.
Me and Jason sound off. We're gonna go eat.
Oh wait, no, that's not fair. No, just save me a slice.
like, just Joe, come knock on the door when it's time to come back in for the big finish.
All right, fine.
Because I want to hear Derrick.
Okay.
Not you though.
So,
all right, go ahead, Joe.
With Bridge to Terabithia, I'm going to spoil everything, guys. So no, with Bridge to Terabithia, I would say it does because it still is that it brings that that fantasy element. Okay. But it's the one where they go into the other worlds, or the worlds start combining and things like that.
That sounds cool.
Yeah. So I would say that movie resonates with me the most because growing up, that was one of the first movies I ever saw like someone my age dying.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So at the end, I think again, she, like how you said, she does try to do it on her own. Yeah. And then she ends up dying, at the end of it because she was trying to go to the other world. Yeah. But she slips and ended up snapping her neck and things like that. So it was one of those things oh my goodness. And I remember just crying, I vividly remember crying. It was just so emotional. So yeah, it was a very, very emotional movie.
I want to check it out. I like my emotional movies.
Exactly. I think you should.
I'm going to put it on my list.
And it's on Disney Plus. And
it is?
an hour and 36 minutes. It's not that long. So yeah, no, I would
see. The cool thing is you're saying she, so I don't know who she is.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Oh man, yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm gonna check that out, bro. I appreciate that recommendation.
All right, guys, we're done. You can come back in, Jason.
All right, so mine, I'm gonna pick. I'll go back to it. Is Pinocchio, because a lot of people are like, "Why do you like Pinocchio so much? Why do you like whether it's the Disney version, the Guillermo del Toro version?" What I love about the story of Pinocchio is that it's a story about the human experience, right? And it's that we're all on a path of some sort towards becoming the most real version of ourselves. And so I love that it's a story. It's not just a story about a boy that has to learn about what it means to be human and have the human experience, right? But it's also about a father that has to learn how to love his son. Because in most Pinocchio stories, Geppetto had a son, and he was basically the aspirational son.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, in most versions, he had a son, and it was an aspirational son. It was like the perfect son. He loses that son. Pinocchio is not the aspirational child. He's a cathartic, motivational child, right? He has to learn goodness. And that's hard for Geppetto to, have to teach him. And that's one of his struggles there. And so he has to learn his son despite his imperfections. That's why I love in the Guillermo del Toro version when Pinocchio, the moment happens where he saves his father from the whale or the fish, whatever. When that moment comes where he turns into a real boy, he doesn't become human. He stays the puppet. He stays wooden, because what Geppetto has to learn is he has to learn to love Pinocchio with his flaws and all. And he's not just going to change into the ideal version of what he wants him to be. Besides all that, I love how that story is all about, it's also a story about not being a puppet. You have to ask who is controlling you, right? Because in the Pinocchio story, you have entertainment and art trying to put the strings back on him to control him. You've got the Pleasure Island sequence where they're trying to ignite his passions in order to make an ass of him, literally. Yeah. So that way he can just become fuel for the economic machine. Or in the Guillermo del Toro version where they send him to a boys' camp that's really a training camp for soldiers, right? So everybody's trying to put the strings on. Everybody's trying to control him, right? Kind of like what we talked about, Joe, with the Truman Show. Yeah. And how do you not become the puppet? How do you break free from tyranny? Because the irony is that while Pinocchio is about learning obedience, it's about learning obedience to what it means to be human, which also involves knowing when to be disobedient. Learning when to say no and hold on to your freedom and not sacrifice your freedom for tyranny. And so the fact that you can have this magical, this creature, this thing, this person from the magical realm that comes and illustrates to us, because again, like a lot of Pinocchio versions, Pinocchio has to experience a death of some sort. And the Guillermo del Toro version makes it literally, where he literally has to die a series of deaths in order to be right. And so the fact that you have this fantasy thing that comes to our world and shows us how we're to live, I'm not saying this in a mocking way or anything, but it kind of reminds me of what Jesus does. Is Jesus comes from a different realm that is foreign and unfamiliar and honestly fantastical to us, and shows us how we need to live, right? That's what the Pinocchio story illustrates. And that's why I resonate with it so much, because it's a different way of getting about that same goal, because fantasy stories ultimately should inform who we are and how we live. And that's where I think we should end this on. Thank you guys so much for being on this episode.
Thank you.
And did you guys have fun?
Yeah.
Good times?
God bless your ministries.
Time to eat.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow as in after dinner.
Yep, we're going to go do that sci-fi episode next, so join us next month for that. And until next time, this is your friendly narrative practitioner, Derrick, signing off, saying go read a good fantasy book, see a great fantasy film, check out my Letterboxd list of 64 fantasy films. Go check it out. And until next time, take care.
Do-do-do.